Imagine you've spent, I don't know, decades building this massive multi-billion-dollar industrial empire.
Right, you're a total titan of industry.
Yeah. And you have a son, biological heir you've raised, to take over the whole thing. But as you get closer to retirement, you look at him and you just decide he's just average.
Like he just doesn't have that killer instinct.
Exactly. He's not ruthless enough. So instead of handing him the keys to the kingdom, you fire him. You totally sideline your own flesh and blood.
Wow.
And then you go out into the middle management ranks of your company and you find a highly competent 35-year-old executive who has absolutely zero relation to you.
Okay.
And you legally adopt him as your son, change his last name to yours, and give him total control of literally everything you own.
I mean, in Western corporate culture, that sounds like the plot of a crazy soap opera.
Oh, absolutely.
Or at least grounds for a massive shareholder lawsuit.
For sure. But in Japan, this practice isn't a scandal at all. It is a highly calculated, centuries-old survival strategy. And it is the secret engine behind some of the most, unkillable businesses on planet Earth.
It really fundamentally breaks our understanding of how family and business and inheritance are supposed to interact.
Yeah, it's a total slap in the face to what we assume is normal.
Exactly. And that friction, that exact moment where Western assumptions crash into Japanese reality, that is where the real story of global economic power begins.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are unpacking something absolutely fascinating. We are looking at a landmark academic paper by Anita D. Bhappu.
It really is a game changer of a paper.
It is. And our mission here is to solve a mystery that has basically frustrated economists for decades.
Right.
Think about the Japanese asset price bubble bursting in 1990. The start of the lost decades.
Yeah, a brutal time.
If you look at the stock market graph from that era, it is just this terrifying, jagged line plunging straight down. I mean, it was one of the most severe economic wipeouts in human history.
It really was. And standard Western economic models looked at that crash and predicted just, terminal devastation for the major players.
Right, because when an ecosystem collapses that violently, the dinosaurs are supposed to die.
That is the baseline assumption of free market capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Massive market failures should theoretically clear the board. The inefficient conglomerates should just fracture, go bankrupt, and make way for new startups.
But the dinosaurs didn't die.
Yeah.
You look at the global landscape today, 30-plus years after that crash,
Yeah.
and the giants, the Mitsubishis, the Toyotas, they're still sitting at the absolute apex of the global supply chain.
Still totally dominating.
Yeah. They survived the 1990s, the Asian financial crisis, global recessions, and they remain titans.
Which is wild.
Our textbook models say these sprawling conglomerates shouldn't even exist anymore, yet they do. And Bhappu's paper argues that the reason they survived isn't because of some secret macroeconomic policy.
Far from it. The thesis Bhappu presents is that the invincible foundation of Japanese corporate dominance has almost nothing to do with modern legal contracts or shareholder agreements or, MBA frameworks. The true scaffolding of these empires is an invisible web of social trust.
Yes.
She calls it an institutional logic.
Okay, let's unpack this term. Institutional logic, because this is the lens for everything we're about to talk about. When I was going through the source material, this concept completely rewired how I view companies.
It's a really powerful idea.
Because an institutional logic isn't a law written on a piece of paper. It's the unwritten, invisible rule book of a society.
Right. It dictates how we organize ourselves, who we actually trust, and how we exchange value when things get tough.
Like the cultural operating system running in the background.
Exactly. In the West, our institutional logic for business is basically the legally binding contract.
Oh, 100%.
We just assume that if two parties are going to coordinate a billion-dollar supply chain, they need a towering stack of legal documents.
With lots of lawyers involved.
Exactly. Enforcing compliance with the constant threat of litigation if someone steps out of line. The contract is our ultimate safety net.
But Bhappu argues that the Japanese corporate operating system is built on something way older and, honestly, way stronger than a modern contract.
It really is.
It's built on the logic of the traditional feudal family. And I want to be clear to you, the listener, we are not talking about family in the warm, fuzzy Thanksgiving dinner sense.
No, not at all.
We are talking about a ruthless, highly pragmatic structure designed for one single thing, the immortal survival of the enterprise.
To really understand why a modern Japanese executive operates the way they do, we cannot look at Wall Street. We have to look back at the Edo period.
Right. Tokugawa Japan.
Exactly. Specifically the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, which lasted from roughly 1600 until 1868.
And this is where the research completely derailed my own assumptions.
Yeah.
Because there's this really lazy tendency in Western business analysis to just lump all of East Asia together.
Oh, it happens all the time.
People assume that, well, Japan, China, and Korea all share these deep Confucian roots, so their corporate cultures must be basically identical, just one big monolithic block of Eastern philosophy.
But Bhappu's work just takes a hammer to that assumption. It's a massive misunderstanding of history.
It's so wrong.
To explain the unique resilience of Japanese corporations, the paper contrasts three very distinct types of feudalism: European, Chinese, and Japanese.
Right. They might look similar from 10,000 feet up,
Yeah.
but the internal mechanics are totally different.
Completely different.
So let's walk through these mechanics, because the contrast is what reveals the genius of the Japanese system. When I read the breakdown of European feudalism, it actually felt incredibly familiar to me.
It felt like modern corporate law, right?
Exactly. It felt like the first draft of an employment contract.
Because it essentially was. European feudalism was a highly legalistic transactional framework. The relationship between a lord and a vassal was defined by explicit rights and duties.
Very transactional.
Right. The lord granted land and protection, and in exchange, the vassal owed a very specific quota of military service.
And if either side failed to deliver, the agreement was just broken.
Exactly. It's a conditional contract. I provide X, you provide Y.
Very clean, very cold. Now, contrast that with Chinese feudalism. The text argues this was rooted in strict orthodox Confucianism. So the organizing principle there wasn't a transaction at all.
No, it was a rigid hierarchy of dominance and absolute submission.
Right.
The traditional Chinese model was deeply patriarchal. The father figure commanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty. It was a one-way street of obedience.
The subordinate didn't have contractual rights like a European vassal.
Exactly. Their role was simply to submit to the patriarch.
So if Europe is the birthplace of the modern contract, and China operated on this top-down model of absolute submission, Japan takes a completely different path.
A very unique path.
Japan borrows bits and pieces from its neighbors, but engineers this uniquely balanced two-way ledger of social debt. The Japanese model is driven by two incredibly vital concepts: ko and on.
Ko and on. These two concepts are the absolute bedrock of the Japanese institutional logic.
Let's define those for the listener.
So ko generally translates to duty, loyalty, or filial piety, and on translates to benevolence, favor, or reciprocal obligation.
But we have to be careful not to view these as abstract, warm concepts.
Right. In Tokugawa Japan, ko and on were highly concrete, inescapable forces that govern literally every human interaction.
I was trying to find an analogy for this while reading, because in China, ko basically meant unquestioning obedience to the father, period.
Yes.
But in Japan, ko was structurally tied to on. You owe loyalty to your superior, but only because that superior actively bestows benevolence upon you.
It is a constant, tension-filled loop.
Right. So if the European model is a legal contract, and the Chinese model is a military dictatorship of the family, the Japanese model is like a living bank account of social favors.
A very demanding bank account.
Yeah, and the catch is, it's a bank account you are structurally never allowed to fully pay off.
That is an incredibly precise way to visualize it. There has to be an equivalence between ko and on. The superior absolutely must provide security to demand loyalty.
And the subordinate must provide loyalty to earn that security.
Exactly. If the superior fails to provide on, the obligation of ko is weakened. It is a mutually assured survival pact.
And to understand how this survival pact turned into a global business strategy, we have to look at the social pyramid of that era, because Tokugawa society was incredibly stratified.
Extremely rigid. The shogunate froze the social order to maintain peace after, centuries of civil war.
So who was at the top?
At the top were the samurai, the warrior, and administrative class. Below them were the peasants, who were actually respected because they produced the food. Below the peasants were the artisans, who crafted goods. And at the absolute, undisputed bottom of the social hierarchy were the merchants.
This blew my mind.
Mm-hmm.
The people who actually handled the money, the business people, were considered the lowest of the low.
They were viewed as societal parasites.
Because they didn't grow crops or forge swords. Right. They just moved wealth around.
Exactly. Now, this extreme social stratification created a fascinating divergence in how ko and on actually worked in practice.
How so?
Well, the samurai class practiced a very rigid, unconditional form of ko. Their loyalty to the shogun was absolute, often unto death, regardless of the benevolence they actually received.
Because they were bound by honor.
Right. But down in the dirt, at the bottom of the pyramid with the merchants, honor doesn't put rice in the bowl.
Yeah, honor doesn't pay the bills.
Precisely. The merchants couldn't rely on martial power or political authority. They were purely economic units in a society that actively despised them.
So what did they do?
Their survival depended entirely on maximizing honors. Cooperation, benevolence, reciprocal obligation. They had to build these intense networks of absolute trust because they had literally zero legal or social protection.
This is the historical irony that I just find so compelling. The samurai, the lords at the top of the pyramid,
Right.
they eventually lose their status when the modern era begins.
Right, they fade away.
But the merchants, the despised bottom feeders who had to rely on mutual favors and hyper-cooperation just to avoid starving, they were the ones who secretly beta-tested the exact blueprint for modern global business.
Necessity forced them to innovate a completely new kind of organization.
And that innovation happened right inside the household. So to understand this merchant blueprint, we have to talk about the Japanese family entity, the IE.
The IE, yes.
And Bhappu's paper points out that translating I simply as family is one of the biggest traps a Westerner can fall into.
It is dangerously misleading.
Because when I hear family business, I picture a mom, a dad, and their kids running a local hardware store. The biological relationships are the entire point. But the IE is something else entirely.
It is much closer to the concept of a corporate entity. The source text draws attention to the actual Chinese character used to write IE in Japanese.
Visually, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it depicts a roof at the top and people underneath it. It literally represents everything existing under one roof.
But it's not just flesh and blood under that roof, right? The paper is very clear that the IE encompasses tangible and intangible assets.
Right. It's the house itself, the land, the merchant inventory.
And the social prestige, the rank within the guild, the actual business enterprise.
The IE is a continuous, immortal entity that exists completely independent of the actual individuals currently living in it.
The people are just temporary stewards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the primary overriding moral imperative of everyone inside that household is that the IE must survive and prosper across generations at literally any cost.
Which brings us back to the hook we started with. The idea that blood is cheap.
Yes.
This is the concept that really shatters the Western understanding of family dynamics. In an American family business, biological inheritance is virtually sacred. The founder builds the company, his kids inherit it. Even if the kids are mediocre, the business exists for the family.
But in the logic of the IE, the family exists for the business.
It's totally flipped. The biological members are subordinate to the survival of the entity.
If we look at comparative data between Chinese and Japanese family businesses, the contrast is just stark.
Right.
Chinese businesses historically rely almost entirely on biological inheritance. Bloodline is paramount. But in the Japanese IE, competence strongly outweighs DNA.
So if the patriarch looks at his oldest son and realizes he's just not cut out for it,
that son is bypassed without hesitation.
He's just out. The father looks at the balance sheets, looks at his son, and basically says, sorry, for the good of the entity, you're not getting the CEO job.
He might be provided for in some minor way, but he will absolutely not inherit the headship. Instead, the family will actively seek out superior talent.
From the outside.
Yes. They might look at their senior apprentices or scout a rising star from a totally different merchant family. They will bring this talented outsider in, arrange a marriage with one of the household's daughters, and legally adopt this adult man.
They literally erase his old identity. They change his surname to the family's surname, and they hand this genetic stranger the keys to the empire.
From a Western perspective, which is so obsessed with individual rights and biological fairness, it seems cold, almost cruel to the biological children.
Yeah, it feels super harsh.
But from the perspective of institutional survival, it is an evolutionary masterstroke. By structurally prioritizing competence over blood, the IE guarantees top-tier executive talent in every single generation.
It totally solves the classic curse of the family business. You know the cliche, right? Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations.
Oh, of course.
The founder builds the empire. The second generation maintains it. The third generation grows up entitled, loses touch, and bankrupts the company buying sports cars.
The Japanese merchants basically solved that entropy problem hundreds of years ago. They simply refused to let the entitled third generation anywhere near the steering wheel.
But I have to push back here, because mechanically, This sounds incredibly risky.
How so?
Well, if you are a merchant patriarch and you legally adopt a 30-year-old outsider to run your entire life's work,
Yeah.
how do you know he won't just steal the assets?
Yeah.
Like, how do you ensure this guy actually possesses the absolute loyalty, the co-required, to prioritize your IE over his own self-interest?
Well, you don't just hand him the keys on day one. You put him through an intense, very deliberate process of psychological and social conditioning.
The paper has a fascinating analogy for this.
It does. It states that new apprentices or these adopted adult heirs were essentially treated like new brides.
Treating a 30-year-old executive like a new bride, what does that actually look like in practice?
Think about the historical role of a new bride entering a patriarchal household. She is entering a foreign ecosystem where she has zero inherent power or status.
Right.
She must learn the unique customs, the rhythms, and the hierarchy of her new family from scratch. She is completely dependent on the goodwill, the on of her new in-laws.
The paper notes that in the West, we view adults as naturally independent. If you hire an adult, you assume they bring their own autonomy. But the IE required deliberate training for dependency.
Exactly. The adopted heir wouldn't live in his own apartment and commute to the shop.
Yeah.
He would physically move into the master's household. He would take every single meal at the family table. He would participate in the private family rituals, the ancestral veneration.
Wow.
He is slowly, methodically isolated from his past identity and entirely integrated into the IU.
It's a systemic reprogram. The patriarch is essentially saying, I am giving you everything. I am giving you the wealth, the status, the future of this lineage. That is my ultimate onto you. But the non-negotiable price of that benevolence is your absolute unwavering co. You must subordinate your individual ego to the survival of this house.
It is a massive, high-stakes moral exchange. And because this transaction is occurring within a society that views unreturned on as a deeply shameful moral failure.
The social pressure is immense.
Exactly. The pressure to remain loyal is much, much stronger than any legal non-compete clause.
So we have this structure, the IE, that ruthlessly prioritizes competence, trains for absolute loyalty, and values the immortal entity over the biological members.
Right.
How does that structural advantage play out over the long arc of history? Let's look at the ultimate test of corporate survival. The historical lifespan of businesses in China versus Japan.
This is where the divergence in institutional logic creates radically different economic realities.
That's night and day.
It really is. Historically, traditional Chinese family businesses have a notoriously short lifespan, typically dissolving or fragmenting within 1 to 3 generations. In stark contrast, Japan possesses some of the oldest continuously operating corporations on the planet. There are Japanese enterprises, like construction firms and inns, that have been operating for over a millennium.
1,000 years of continuous operation. That is staggering. And the secret to that immortality, according to Bhappu's research, comes down to one highly specific mechanism: how the society handles the death of the patriarch.
The inheritance showdown.
Yes. So let's examine the Chinese model first.
In the traditional Chinese family system, rooted in that Confucian patriarchal structure, wealth is viewed as belonging to the family as a whole, managed by the father. When the patriarch dies, the cultural norm and often the legal requirement was to divide the family wealth and property equally among all the surviving sons.
On a human level, that sounds incredibly fair. Everyone gets an equal slice of the pie.
It is fair to the individuals, but it is absolute poison for the corporate entity. Imagine a highly successful merchant family. They've accumulated significant capital, a huge warehouse, a fleet of trading carts. The patriarch dies, leaving 4 sons.
Okay, so what happened?
The capital is divided into 4 smaller pools. The warehouse must be sold and the proceeds split, or physically partitioned. The fleet is divided.
You instantly destroy your economies of scale.
Precisely. Those 4 sons now have a fraction of the market power their father had. They might set up their own independent, competing households, and when they die, their smaller pools of capital are divided again.
So within a few generations, the wealth is completely pulverized.
The business cannot sustain scale, it cannot invest in major long-term infrastructure, and eventually, it dissolves.
So the Chinese method of equal division guarantees fragmentation. Now, how does the Japanese IE handle the death of the patriarch?
The fundamental rule of the IE is that the entity is indivisible. You cannot chop the Ruth in half.
Right.
Therefore, the entire estate, the business, the land, the capital, the name, passes intact to a single heir, primogeniture.
The one chosen heir gets 100% of the pie. So the corporate entity retains its massive scale generation after generation.
Exactly.
But this raises a huge logistical question. If only one guy gets the entire empire, what happens to the other brothers? The competent biological sons who just didn't get the top job, or the skilled apprentices who weren't adopted? Do they just get fired and pushed out into the snow?
Not at all. And this is where the Japanese system evolves from a simple survival tactic into a mechanism for massive exponential expansion.
This part is brilliant.
The single-heir system generated a surplus of capable, trained men who needed a livelihood. So the system created a release valve. The bunk.
The bong.
It translates to a branch family. The primary heir remains in the ancestral home and assumes leadership of the honk, the main family.
Yeah.
But the outgoing head of the household, before he retires or dies, will often provide the non-inheriting sons or top apprentices with a small portion of capital or maybe the rights to trade in a neighboring territory.
To establish their own branch families.
Exactly.
This was the biggest aha moment for me in the entire paper. When you visualize this process, they aren't just giving the younger brothers a consolation prize. This is the ancient biological ancestor of the modern corporate franchise network.
It absolutely is.
It's an incredible strategy for geographic and market expansion.
Think about the problem of expansion in a pre-industrial society. If a merchant in Edo wants to expand his textile business to Osaka, he can't just wire money and hire a local manager.
The communication lag is too long.
And the risk of the manager embezzling the funds is way too high. You need someone you can trust with your life.
So instead of hiring a consultant or drafting an employment contract for a subsidiary manager, the Japanese merchant simply spins off a new family branch.
He uses the deeply conditioned ko and on of the family structure to scale the business.
Wow.
The main family, the honk, acts as the central bank and strategic headquarters. The branch families, the bunk, act as the regional distributors or specialized manufacturers.
So they are legally independent households, but socially and economically, they are tightly bound to the main family through permanent debts of gratitude.
Exactly. And this expanding decentralized web of main families and branch families, this structure has a specific name in Japanese sociology.
Right. It's called the Dozuku.
The Dozuku.
It sounds like a military formation.
Well, it operated with the discipline of one. The Dozuku is a hierarchically organized set of branch families united around a central main family.
Okay.
And what is crucial to understand is how status was determined within this massive network. It wasn't based on how closely related you were by blood to the founder.
Wait, really? I would totally assume the biological brother's branch family would outrank the adopted apprentice's branch family.
Not in the Dozuku. Remember, the institutional logic prioritizes the survival of the enterprise over blood.
Right, right.
Within the network, a branch family's status was determined by its economic contribution to the main family, its tenure, and its absolute loyalty.
That's fascinating.
An apprentice who was spun off into a branch family 50 years ago and who has reliably sent profits back to the honk every year will hold far higher status than the biological nephew who just started a branch last year.
So loyalty and tenure are prized above all else. This totally blows up the Western concept of nepotism. It's a strange kind of meritocratic loyalty.
And this dynamic is the exact historical birthplace of the modern Japanese corporate obsession with seniority and lifetime loyalty.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
When a modern Japanese corporation promotes an executive based on how many decades they've served the company rather than their quarterly sales figures, Western analysts often criticize it as inefficient.
They call it a lack of meritocracy.
But they are missing the point. The Japanese firm is evaluating a different kind of merit, the proven long-term accumulation of ko.
It's not a modern, flawed HR policy. It's the structural legacy of the Dozuku functioning exactly as designed. Okay, so we have established this baseline. We have the Dozuku, a highly efficient, functionally immortal, geographically expanding web of families acting as business networks, completely reliant on the social ledger of ko and on.
Right.
Now let's see what happens when this ancient system collides with the modern world. Let's fast forward to the late 19th century. The year is 1853. American Commodore Matthew Perry sails his black ships into Tokyo Bay, ending over 2 centuries of Japanese isolation.
It is an absolute geopolitical shock to the system. The Tokugawa shogunate collapses, and the Meiji Restoration begins in 1868.
And the new Japanese leadership looks across the ocean and sees the terrifying reality of the industrialized West.
They see British steamships, American railways, and massive centralized capital.
It's an existential threat. They realize that if they don't industrialize their economy overnight, they're going to be carved up and colonized just like their neighbors.
They need a massive industrial base, and they need it yesterday.
Now, a conventional approach like the approach many developing nations took would be to look at the successful Western powers and import their institutional logic wholesale.
Right. Pass laws establishing free market capitalism, import British corporate law, and hope the invisible hand builds a steel industry.
But Japan doesn't do that. They don't have time to wait for a free market to organically develop. And honestly, the idea of hyper-individualistic capitalism probably terrified a society built on communal obligation.
Precisely. The Meiji oligarchs looked inward. They looked at the tools they already possessed, and what they saw were these massive, highly organized, profoundly loyal merchant family networks, the Daisuku.
Right.
The government realized that these family networks were already acting like proto-corporations, so rather than replacing them with Western models, the government decided to supercharge them.
They took these networks of like silk merchants and sake brewers and essentially turned them into national industrial weapons.
They executed one of the most brilliant acts of economic camouflage in history.
Camouflage? How so?
The government allowed these merchant families to adopt Western legal structures, specifically the joint stock corporation and the holding company.
Okay.
But they used these legal contracts merely as an outer shell, a disguise, to interface with the global market. Beneath the legal paperwork, the ancient Daisuku structure remained entirely intact.
I want to make sure I am visualizing this clearly. If I'm a Western auditor in, say, 1910, looking at one of these new Japanese conglomerates on paper, what am I seeing versus what is actually happening?
On paper, you see a modern corporate pyramid. At the very top, you see a holding company. This holding company controls the shares of various operating companies beneath it.
It's very Western.
But culturally and operationally, that holding company is acting exactly as the honk, the main family. It is staffed by the patriarch and the inner circle. It controls the central pool of capital, usually through its own private bank, and it dictates strategy.
So the holding company is literally acting as the father.
Yes. And beneath it, you have a vast array of newly formed industrial companies. A shipping line, a coal mining operation, a steel mill, a trading house.
And on paper, these are just subsidiaries.
But culturally, they act as the bunk, the branch families.
The loyal sons.
Exactly. The main family bank funnels capital down to the mining branch. The mining branch provides coal at a preferential rate to the shipping branch. The shipping branch transports the goods for the trading house branch.
They operate as this closed, highly synergistic ecosystem.
Bound not just by the legal ownership of the holding company, but by centuries of internalized co-and-on.
And the government is actively feeding this beast, right? The state is handing over government-built shipyards and mines to these specific families at fire sale prices.
Because the government knows these families have the structural discipline to scale them rapidly.
This partnership between the state and the Daisuku creates these terrifyingly powerful, diversified conglomerates that rapidly come to control the entire economic life of the Japanese nation.
And these supercharged family networks are what history remembers as the Zaibatsu?
The Zaibatsu.
The financial cliques. Names that still dominate today, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo. They were the engine of Japan's miraculous rise to power, allowing a feudal island nation to rival the industrial might of the U.S. and the British Empire in less than 50 years.
It is a staggering achievement. They took a survival tactic engineered by the lowest caste of society to avoid starving in the 1600s and scaled it into a global economic superweapon.
It's incredible.
But, as Bhappu's paper explores, the true test of this institutional logic, the absolute proof that this wasn't just a fragile system dependent on legal loopholes, happens when the entire country goes up in flames. Let's move to the crucible, the aftermath of World War II.
It is 1945. Japan is defeated, its cities are in ruins, and the Allied forces, commanded by American General Douglas MacArthur, occupy the country.
Right.
The Allies are tasked with democratizing Japan and ensuring it can never wage aggressive war again.
And the Americans are not naive. They look at the Japanese war machine, and they correctly identify that the military didn't build the battleships and the fighter planes by themselves.
The industrial engine driving the war was the Zaibatsu.
Exactly.
The Allied command realized that the extreme concentration of wealth and industrial capacity within these few centralized family conglomerates was a primary driver of Japanese imperialism.
What else did they do?
They concluded that as long as the Zaibatsu existed, Japan retained the structural capacity to rearm. Therefore, the official occupation policy was the absolute ruthless dismantling of the zaibatsu system.
They didn't just break up monopolies with antitrust lawsuits. They went in with a sledgehammer. They actively tried to sever the central nervous system of these corporate empires.
It was a total legal and financial decapitation.
Wow.
The occupation authorities passed laws explicitly abolishing the holding companies, the hunk. They confiscated the massive wealth and stock portfolios of the founding families, compensating them with rapidly inflating government bonds that basically wiped out their fortunes.
They took everything.
And they legally severed the ties between the main banks and the industrial subsidiaries.
They literally made it illegal for these companies to coordinate with each other.
Furthermore, they executed a massive purge of the executive class. The patriarchs, the board members, the senior executives who had run these empires were forcibly removed from their positions and banned from corporate leadership.
Wow.
The Allies believed they had thoroughly and permanently eradicated the zaibatsu from the face of the earth.
Because if you look at the legal contracts, the network is dead. The holding company brain is dissolved, the manufacturing organs are isolated, the wealth is gone, and the leaders are fired. Any Western corporation subjected to that level of targeted destruction would simply cease to exist.
It would be a footnote in a history book.
But this is where the profound power of the institutional logic reveals itself. This is the central thesis of Bhappu's paper. The Allies successfully destroyed the legal ties. They shredded the contracts and burned the organizational charts. But they fundamentally failed to understand that the true glue holding these empires together was never legal.
It was social.
Exactly.
They couldn't legislate away the social capital.
The invisible web of co and on.
Exactly. The top executives were purged, yes. But what about the middle management? The department heads, the mid-level bankers, the factory managers.
Right, the guys actually running the floor.
These men had spent their entire lives, often their entire family histories, embedded within the Dazuku framework. They had been deeply conditioned in the logic of the IE. They survived the purge. And suddenly, they found themselves in charge of these newly independent, fractured companies in a devastated post-war economy.
So what do they do? Because they don't have a holding company forcing them to cooperate anymore. They don't have a patriarch giving orders.
What the sociological data shows is almost hard to believe for a Western economist. Without any legal obligation whatsoever, and often in direct defiance of the spirit of the anti-monopoly laws, these managers from the former branch families just kept meeting up.
I love the visual of this so much. The American authorities are sitting in their offices thinking they've democratized the economy, and meanwhile, the Japanese managers are just going to the local pub.
They gathered at the izakaya after work. They formed presidents' clubs that met for lunch once a month. They played golf. They relied on their informal, lifelong networks.
Of course they did.
In a chaotic, destroyed economy where credit was scarce and trust was basically zero, who are you going to do business with? A stranger with a new legal contract? Or the guy who used to run the shipping branch of your zaibatsu, whose family has owed your family on for 3 generations.
You go with the guy in your social network.
Yeah.
Because his loyalty is guaranteed by the culture, not by a piece of paper.
Exactly. So they organically began to reconstruct the networks. The former Zaibatsu Bank, now legally independent, naturally began to act like the honk again, channeling precious post-war capital preferentially to the former subsidiary companies, which acted like the bunk.
And to protect themselves from hostile takeovers by foreign capital or domestic rivals, they utilized a brilliant defensive mechanism: cross-shareholding.
Oh, this is crucial.
I want to make sure we explain this clearly to the listener because it's the architectural marvel of the post-war rebuild.
Cross-shareholding is essentially the financial manifestation of mutual social obligation. Imagine 50 independent companies that all used to belong to the Mitsubishi Zaibatsu.
Right.
Company A buys 2% of the stock in Company B, C, and D. Company B buys 2% of A, C, and D. They weave this massive interlocking web of minority ownership.
Right.
No single company owns a controlling stake in any other. There is no holding company at the top. But collectively, the network owns a 60 or 70% majority of every single company within the group.
It creates an impenetrable fortress. An outside raider can never buy enough shares on the open market to take over Company A because Company A's stock is safely locked up in the vaults of its 49 closest friends.
And those friends will never sell to a hostile raider because doing so would be a catastrophic violation of to the group.
Wow.
Through these informal presidents' clubs and extensive cross-shareholding, they effectively recreated the massive coordination and scale of the zaibatsu, but without the centralized family bloodlines and without the vulnerable holding company structure.
And this newly evolved, legally decentralized but socially impenetrable network is what we now call the Keiretsu.
The Keiretsu, the corporate groups that drove the Japanese economic miracle of the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
That's amazing.
The Keiretsu is simply the ancient logic of the IE operating at a macroeconomic scale. It survived the ultimate stress test, the literal destruction of its host country, because social capital proved infinitely more resilient than legal capital.
This macroeconomic story is mind-blowing, but I want to bring it down to the ground level for a minute.
Sure.
We've been talking about massive industrial conglomerates and banks, but what does it actually feel like to be a regular employee inside this system? If I have a fresh college graduate in Tokyo, stepping into my first job at a Keiretsu company, how does this feudal logic dictate my Tuesday morning?
To understand that lived experience, we have to look at the physical and psychological architecture of the modern Japanese office space.
Okay.
The fundamental unit of organization in a Japanese firm is not the individual employee. It is the ka, or the section. And Bhappu's text points out that the section is designed as a direct psychological replica of the feudal IE.
The office department is literally structured to trigger the subconscious feelings of the traditional household. That's wild.
Consider the physical layout. If you walk into a traditional corporate office in the West, you see a celebration of individualism and hierarchy. You see isolated cubicles, private offices for managers, closed doors.
Right. It emphasizes separation and individual tasks.
Exactly. But if you walk into a traditional Japanese corporate section, you see a large open room. The desks are pushed together into long islands. There are no walls.
It's completely communal. Everyone can hear everyone else's phone calls. Everyone can see who is working hard and who is slacking.
And at the absolute head of that long table, visually presiding over the entire group, sits the kacho, the section head. He doesn't have a private office. He sits at the head of the table, constantly observing and interacting.
Right.
In the psychological framework of the section, the kacho is positioned exactly as the patriarch of the IE. He is the father figure.
And just like in the merchant families of the Edo period, everyone in the section is expected to contribute to the collective output, regardless of their specific job description.
Yes.
If a deadline is looming, you don't say, "That's not my job." You jump in to help the group because the survival and prestige of the section, the IE, is paramount.
And the relationship between the section head and his subordinates is entirely governed by the invisible ledger of ko and on. The section head is expected to act with benevolence. He doesn't just manage their spreadsheets, he mentors them, he might help arrange their marriages, he attends their funerals.
Wow, he takes a paternal interest in their entire lives.
He provides the on.
Yes. And in return, the employees owe him and the section their absolute ko. They work staggering overtime hours, often unpaid, not necessarily to finish a specific task, but to physically demonstrate their loyalty and solidarity with the group. To leave the office before the section head is seen as a failure of ko.
This dynamic completely reframes one of the most famous and misunderstood features of the Japanese corporate world: lifetime employment.
Oh, this is a huge point.
When Westerners hear lifetime employment, they usually view it through the lens of individual rights. They see it as the ultimate HR perk, or almost like a form of corporate socialism.
Right, like, wow, those Japanese companies are so generous, they just guarantee you a job forever, no matter what happens to the economy.
It is deeply mischaracterized in the West. It is not charity. It is the ultimate institutionalized expression of the ko and on exchange.
All right, break that down.
The corporation, acting as the macro family, extends the ultimate on to the new graduate, a guarantee of lifetime financial security, belonging, and identity.
You are brought into the family. You will not starve.
But the price for that security is absolute. The contract you are signing socially, if not legally, demands your lifetime of unwavering ko. You surrender your autonomy to the corporate family.
It's a really high-stakes trade-off.
Yeah.
If you are an American worker and you get a job offer from a competitor across the street for a 20% raise, the rational capitalist move is to take the new job. You owe your current employer nothing beyond the 2 weeks' notice stipulated in your contract.
But in the traditional Japanese system, jumping ship to a competitor for a higher salary is a profound moral betrayal. It is a rejection of the on that the company has invested in you.
It's turning your back on the family.
Furthermore, you cannot refuse a transfer. If the company decides they need you to move your family to a remote branch office in Hokkaido, you go. Your individual career preferences are secondary to the strategic needs of the IE.
You get to eat at the household table forever, but the table owns you. This explains the promotion system as well, right?
Yes.
If the goal is to reinforce this lifelong mutual obligation, then promoting people based solely on who had the best sales quarter basically disrupts the harmony of the family.
Exactly. The system of pay and promotion in these traditional firms heavily weights seniority and tenure. Your salary increases predictably as you age and your family expenses grow. You are rewarded for the duration of your loyalty, exactly in keeping with the tradition of the Dozuko, where the oldest branch families held the highest status.
That's a total paradigm shift.
It prioritizes long-term stability and deep social integration over short-term, cutthroat competition between individuals.
It's a beautifully closed loop, but seeing this massive architecture of obligation, the absolute obedience traded for absolute security, it forces a really critical question.
What's that?
Well, we live in an era of hyper-globalization. Modern Western capitalism is ruthlessly efficient. It celebrates disruption, gig work, massive layoffs via email, and agile maneuvering. Why hasn't the sheer brutal force of modern global capitalism just wiped this feudal relic off the map?
That's a fair point.
Why do Japanese workers and executives continue to opt into this system? Especially when, like, Toyota tries to open a plant in the U.S. and tries to implement this family logic, it often causes huge cultural clashes with American workers who want individualism.
Yeah.
So why does it survive in Japan?
That is the pivotal question Bhappu asks at the conclusion of her research. Why does the institutional logic of the family persist in the face of immense pressure to modernize? And the answer is fascinating because it proves that this system isn't being forced on the population by a totalitarian state.
Actually, the paper points out that the state tried to kill it.
They did. After World War II, during the occupation, the Japanese government heavily revised the civil code. They actively tried to legally abolish the traditional IE system in family law, moving the legal framework closer to Western models of nuclear families and individual rights.
So the state tried to legislate the IE out of existence.
But the culture ignored the law. The logic of the IE retreated from the domestic family sphere and became fiercely entrenched in the corporate world.
Why? If the law gives you the right to act like a free market individual, why choose to bind yourself to a corporate patriarch?
Because of rational choice in the face of uncertainty. If we want to synthesize this entire phenomenon, we have to understand the ultimate value of social capital.
Let's break that down. We all intuitively understand financial capital, cash in the bank, stock options. We understand human capital, your college degree, your coding skills. But social capital is less tangible.
Social capital is the tangible resource that exists in the relationships between people. It is the accumulated trust, the shared norms, the mutual obligations, the ko and on. Now, consider the last century and a half of Japanese history. It is a story of unrelenting turbulence. They went from an isolated feudal society to rapid, chaotic industrialization. They endured catastrophic regime changes, fought devastating world wars, survived atomic bombings, navigated a foreign military occupation, and rode the roller coaster of the greatest economic bubble and subsequent crash in modern history.
When you lay it out like that, it is an environment of absolute chaos. The ground is constantly shifting underneath them.
In a world that turbulent, where governments collapse, currencies hyperinflate, and legal systems are rewritten by occupying armies, what is your safest asset?
It's definitely not a legal contract.
Exactly, because a new government or a market crash can incinerate a contract overnight.
The only thing you can actually rely on is the person sitting next to you.
The safest, most deeply logical bet a human being can make in a highly unpredictable environment is to aggressively preserve their network of absolute trust, to cling to the social capital of the corporate family. Japanese workers and executives continue to choose the family logic because, historically speaking, the invisible web of mutual obligation is the only thing that has never failed them. It rebuilt their economy from the ashes of World War II. It sustained them through the lost decades.
So it's not an irrational adherence to a backwards tradition. It is a highly rational insurance policy against the chaos of history. They nurture these restrictive relationships because the alternative facing a volatile world as an isolated individual armed only with a resume is fundamentally terrifying.
The persistence of the family logic is a continuous collective choice by individuals to prioritize the safety of social capital over the risky freedom of individual mobility.
Wow, okay. Let's try to pull all of these threads together because this has been a massive deep dive. We started with the mystery of the lost decades. An economic crash that by all Western metrics should have annihilated Japan's corporate giants.
Right.
And we discovered that the secret to their unkillable nature isn't found in modern economics. It's found in a 400-year-old social blueprint.
We saw how the lowest class of Tokugawa society, the merchants, were forced to innovate a survival mechanism based on reciprocal obligation, the balance of ko and on.
We explored the brutal, immortal pragmatism of the IE, a system so dedicated to survival that it will gladly fire a biological son and adopt a talented stranger just to ensure capable leadership.
We traced how the single heir system forced the creation of branch families, the Dazuku, which provided the structural DNA for massive, geographically expanding networks bound by loyalty rather than just equity.
We saw the government supercharge those networks into the zaibatsu to fight off Western imperialism, and we saw those same networks miraculously reassemble themselves as the Keiretsu after being literally outlawed and dismantled by the U.S. military, all because guys going out for drinks refused to abandon their social capital.
And finally, we brought it down to the micro level, seeing how the modern Japanese office operates as a psychological replica of the feudal household, trading the absolute security of lifetime employment for absolute, unwavering obedience.
So I want to turn this around to you, the listener. Think about your own career. Think about your industry. We all operate under the assumption that our professional lives are governed by the employment contracts we sign and the org charts we sit in.
Right.
But how much of your actual daily reality, your ability to get things done, your promotions, or your safety during a round of layoffs, how much of that is actually governed by the piece of paper?
It's a great question.
And how much of it is governed by the invisible institutional logic? The unwritten rules of loyalty, the favors you owe your mentor, the people who brought you up in the industry. Are you operating purely as a free market individual, or are you actually relying on the social capital of an IE without even realizing it?
It is a profound realization about human nature. And as we look toward the future, this research leaves us with a critical, lingering question.
What is the ultimate takeaway for the global economy?
Well, economies around the world are entering an era of unprecedented pressure. We are facing the rapid acceleration of the AI revolution, the expansion of the gig economy, and the systematic dismantling of traditional employment security.
Things are getting really unstable.
Exactly. The cold, legalistic Western contract is offering less and less protection to the average worker. Jobs are becoming transient. Stability is disappearing. As that macroeconomic storm gets worse, and the individualistic model becomes too precarious for the average person to survive, will people continue to champion hyper-individualism? Or, when things get truly terrifying, will we see workers and corporations across the globe subconsciously returning to the ancient, informal strategies of the family to protect their social capital and simply survive the turbulence?
Will the future of global work look less like an algorithmically optimized gig app and more like a return to the Jizuku? Will we trade our freedom back for security? That is something to seriously think about the next time you log into work. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.